Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Autism Stories. I'm your host, Doug Bletcher, the founder of Autism Personal Coach. Autistic people are the true experts of the autistic experience, and Autism Stories is where we interview autistic people to learn from their stories, experiences, and get their insights. If you would like to be notified about each week's episode of Autism Stories, we suggest you subscribe on your favorite podcast listening platform. We would also appreciate it if you could give us a positive rating and review, as it will help others to learn about autism stories. On today's episode, Jim Hoerricks joins me to discuss being a special education teacher, the problems with teaching students to read, and his upcoming book that teaches literacy for Gestalt language processors. We hope you enjoy today's conversation. Jim, thanks so much for joining me today.
Well, you're welcome.
Now, starting out our conversation, I'd like to learn, where does your story in the autistic community begin?
Well, I guess it starts in DSM-4, but even before that, I am a child of immigrants, I guess. I was a foster child. I was part of the system, and I was taken from my parents when I was about 2 here in Southern California and deposited with a family that raised me until I was about 17. But I knew, because I grew up kind of poor, that, for working class folks, there are very few options. I'm in my 50s. And so my first choice was the military. And I went to enlist in the US Navy. And I went down and I took the physical, and I failed the physical because I failed the hearing test. And I'm in the hearing test tank, and I'm hearing tones, and I'm pressing buttons. And I have some very rude Marine yelling in my ear about it. I'm doing so poorly, although I'm hearing tones and pressing buttons. And didn't know why. I've got perfectly good hearing as far as I'm concerned. And then fast forward, I had to find a different way in life. And I share with my students now that I graduated from American high school, a very good American high school, where Richard Nixon graduated from, functionally illiterate. And so these few things, problems with language, problems with sensory inputs and so on. When I joined police service here in Los Angeles as a forensic scientist, I had to take a physical again. And the audiologist this time was a little bit more informed than the Marine in the mid-'80s, and said that I had technically failed the hearing test, but I had definitely hearing because I'm having a conversation and so on. But she suspected there was some sort of auditory delay. And that's where I first encountered stuff that we now put on the autism spectrum. My initial diagnoses under DSM-4 were Asperger's, sensory integration disorder, and sensory processing disorder, which in DSM-5 are all lumped into autism spectrum disorder. From an ICD standpoint, I am autistic with functional language impairment and no intellectual disability.
There are many misconceptions about us as autistics, and that begins in our childhood. Just a minute or so ago, you mentioned your students, and you're a special education teacher. So I'm wondering, what are some misconceptions educators have about your students that you think are absolutely false?
I think a lot of my opinion is informed by my path to the classroom. I started off in police service. I was a forensic scientist. I started off in police service illiterate, and I didn't come into functional language really until my early 30s. What I tell my children now is a very expensive proposition to do this painful retail. With the pandemic and the changes in the industry and so on, I found myself unemployed. And with degrees, I was able to transition into becoming a teacher and joined with Teach for America to do that. My pathway into the classroom was kind of informed, I would say, from the mindset that people like me don't exist, that autistic people, quote unquote, nonverbal autistic people, would never join the teaching profession and be a peer and be in these professional trainings and development sessions and colleges and these types of things. It was almost as if there was no place for me, that you have typically performing students and everyone else, they get shuffled off to some kind of supportive environment, some kind of therapy or these types. I have found now as a resource specialist, as an inclusion specialist here at my school, the teachers follow their brief, they teach to the standard. In essence, they're all brilliant. They're all well-meaning and compassionate people, but they're held to account on whether or not the students are reaching the standard. but the standard doesn't account for the students. And so myself, as a Gestalt processor, for example, I find nothing about myself in reading instruction, right, in professional development and teacher prep and all that stuff, does not acknowledge that I even exist and the way that I learn language exists. And again, we are shuffled off to speech and language pathologists and so on, and it's hoped that will eventually gain literacy. And so the fact that I graduated high school in the 80s completely literate doesn't surprise me, because the teachers were wholly unprepared for my type of language processing. And that problem exists to this day, that we assume that there is one human learning style. We see catchphrase like the science of reading. And then we hold teachers to account, even though science would tell you that if 40% of the room isn't getting, then something must be wrong with the science. And so with that in mind, I'm a bit of pushing back, not only in the classroom, but also professionally, writing another book that deals with how to teach language holistically. And it's been done for quite some time. It's just not done in places where English is the dominant language and English is taught in school for some reason. But I find, kind of to summarize that it is presumed that autistic people are not capable. It is presumed that we need heavy support and services, and indeed some of us do. But it's never assumed that we will enter spaces with the cool kids. It's never assumed that we'll be in, again, with professional peers, as out as our authentic selves, flappy and happy and needing hearing protection and these types of things, right, that tend to attract attention. But it's just assumed that you'll mask. It's assumed that you'll just kind of blend in to get in and all of that stuff. And those of us who are completely out are kind of frowned upon, kind of bullied and punished a bit.
When I think about communication for myself, to me, energy is probably the number one way that I communicate. So understanding energy is really an important thing. And I think especially in environments like classrooms. Now, you've written an important article about understanding how classroom energy states affect autistic students and their behavior. So what are some important things to think about in these environments?
Wow, indeed. I was just having this conversation with a behavioral interventionist. I'm teaching summer school. It's the last day of summer school for us, about this. And when parents get the call from school and the child isn't behaving well, then discussions happen around functional behavior and behavioral analysis and these types of things. They're trying to make sure that the child kind of models what is appropriate behavior of how we turn that in the classroom. So whatever this disruption is happening in the class, they're trying to find a way to explain what the child is doing and then to train them out of that behavior, right? But in my investigation of this, I found that none of the behaviorists had ever heard of the term alexithymia. So when I bring that up to them and I say, well, have you considered, speaking specifically of an autistic student who has a BII, and I have a few on my caseload, have you ever heard of alexithymia? And the answer is no, right? It's not been anywhere in their professional brief. It's not been anywhere in their training. And so then they asked me, okay, well, explain alexithymia to me. And I said, well, we begin with the presumption of autistic people as hyper-empath, that we're absorbing the energies from around us. And a lot of times these energy states in classrooms are very triggering, right? It's not just the bright lights and the noises and stuff, but it's, Johnny over in the corner having a bad time, right? And these types of things. Alexithymia takes that empathy and confuses things a bit. Alexithymia is many things. In popular, meme culture where the self-diagnosed are educating the self-diagnosed, it's often pointed out that alexithymia is an inability to name feelings. But the research is actually quite complex in this. Yes, indeed, it's an inability to name feelings, to identify feelings and energy, feeling states with yourself. And I tend to use energy and feeling kind of interoperably. I mean, to me, they're the same thing. But alexithymia and hyperempathy combined, I could be absorbing the energies from my neighbors. I could be absorbing behaviors from those around me. I could be absorbing happiness and sadness and anger and aggression from those around me and not know it, not be able to identify that this thing, that this way that I'm feeling at the moment doesn't originate from within me. So we really as autistic hyper-empaths. And again, not everybody is hyper-empathic and not everybody is alexithemic. I happen to be myself, and so I can speak from lived experience of this. As adults, there are entire different dimensions to this socially and so on. But in the classroom, we see new behaviors popping up all the time and wonder where that comes from. And then we ask the student, why did you do that? I have no idea. I have no idea they're doing that, right? And one of my students, as an example, he picked up this new behavior that was very threatening to his teacher, right? He's a very large boy and very strong, very powerful he's Latin American, but he's got a very powerful personality to him, very forceful personality, kind of alpha male type. He fancies himself. And he started making this kind of racking a rifle motion, and like he was loading a rifle and racking around and firing down range and all these things. And I recognized what he was doing with his hands was a stim. I recognized that he was doing some kind of self-regulating behavior, but I also recognized what it looked like because, again, in police service, you kind of understand how firearms work. And so I pulled him aside and I talked to him about it. And he didn't, first of all, realize that he was doing it. And I started to walk him through a bit of where might this behavior come into play? Where might he have found this behavior? And he wasn't sure. He was very hesitant, didn't realize again that he was doing it. And certainly was apologetic about, being threatening to the teacher and so on. But I kind of let it lie, and I was doing my usual bit around the room, and I heard a couple of people, within earshot, talking about Call of Duty and how they couldn't wait to get home and play Call of Duty, and they were describing certain missions and so on. You put two and two together, and you realize that my student had also overheard that discussion, also overheard, through energy states, that excitement about going into this, virtual battlefield. And he was a fan of Call of Duty. And so unconsciously, his stim, his usual flappy stims that I tend to do with my hands, became more purposeful and became more targeted towards this desire to go home and play Call of Duty, right? And if you're a behaviorist and you don't understand alexithymia, you don't really understand where all of this is coming from. And the fact that it's not threatening, it's a modification of the usual stim and these types of things. But when you point that out to behaviorists and they say, oh, wow, I guess that makes perfect sense, right? And then you translate alexithymia into conversations with older students. I think it's disfavored for professionals to have kind of birds and bees discussion with children on campus, but in college spaces, the conversations that I've had around alexithymia and adulthood is that, again, kind of stealing from my book a little bit, that what we know as autism has been around since man, right? There are descriptions in ancient manuscripts of this kind of transfer of energy states and how it is indeed very functional and very pleasurable. And in Indian culture, it's called Tantra. This exchange of energy states is sacred to that culture. And so here in the West, we're trying to extinguish behaviors, we're trying to assign negative labels to it. And elsewhere, different cultures, they say, oh, what a great thing it is, right? And if you read that book called Stealing Fire, they're talking about getting into flow states. They're talking about these alexithymic states and teams. And essentially, they're repackaging our lived experience and commoditizing it and selling it back to very rich people and saying, oh, this is how to maximize productivity instead of just hiring an autistic person, skipping all the rest.
Having new experiences, particularly learning from people in different countries and cultures, I think can only help expand the way that we kind of view the world. You've lived and worked in 3 different continents and engaged with learners from over 40 countries, from what I understand. How have those experiences kind of shaped you as a teacher?
Well, yes, I've been privileged. I think kind of that solitary forager hypothesis, that hunger and pain and cold drive our wandering need. And, I've been wandering kind of my whole life, and I found a way to have someone else fund it, growing up poor and everything. I found kind of a value for value model where people would pay for me to come and teach them this science that, I was on the forefront and, wrote the book on and so on. But I think kind of tying in with alexithymia, having the ability to read the room at an energy level, that's very important. It's very valuable. And so, as an example, I was part of an initiative during the Obama administration to reform forensic sciences in the United States. And in the very beginning, we were very, very successful writing policy statements where you have to imagine that in very many of the disciplines in forensic science, there were no standards. It was just the police services, the FBI, and so on, saying it was so, and it was so. And case after case was coming up to say, well, did you conduct actual science? You call it forensic science, but did you conduct actual science? Did you collect data? Did it inform reforms and so on? And various congressional efforts at standardizing and reforming forensic science were engaged with and didn't go anywhere. And then Obama came along, and he had a very different kind of point of view about the citizen and the government and so on. He created what was called the Organization of Scientific Area Committees of Forensic Science. And I was one of the founding members of that. And my discipline, digital and multimedia evidence, basically the video, audio, image part of forensic science. And I wrote a book years ago called Forensic Photoshop, as an example. But once we had started creating these standards documents and so on, and we would bring in people from the UK, from Australia, from Nigeria, from other places that had kind of established constabularies with forensic science teams and so on, and asked their input. And then as it matured, the Obama administration through the State Department started sending us abroad. I ended up kind of a sole practitioner in the Republic of South Africa, advising them on the reform of their forensic science in my discipline, and spent some time working there, working in 4 languages, only one of which I speak. I speak German as well, but I could kind of understand Afrikaans, which is Dutch, essentially. But I had no idea what the Xhosa speakers were saying or what the Zulu speakers were saying. And so as a group, with an English, if you will, lieutenant, and an English brigadier, but an Afrikaner warrant officer, and a Zulu captain, and a whole bunch of workers that were Cape-coloured and Xhosa and so on, we kind of collectively helped each other out through this. And I think that premise that alexithymia just doesn't exist in autistic populations, I think it exists across the human population. We were able to kind of feel each other out. So we were able to collaborate and cooperate and get things sorted out in quite a quick manner. My history as being an illiterate individual helps me to communicate in different ways, to get the point across on how we're doing. And I saw a bit of that in some of the work we were doing with trying to automate functions and create new forms on these types of things. And the person who was in charge of accreditation, a very nice lieutenant, Afrikaner, she says to me, well, Jim, it's great that you want to do all this stuff, but frankly, half of the constabulary here is illiterate. Right? So we focus on really nice pictorials and very graphic, depictions of what we're trying to get across, because not only are our inspectors not entirely literate, but neither is the jury pool, right? And so we have to focus on telling stories. We have to focus on photos and so on. So we want to make sure that our tech is up to scratch on that. But, we are not so concerned with detailed report writing and automations and these types of things. And I really got to be thinking like, well, I'm not unique, right? I'm not a freak of nature, that there are many, many more people out there that have issues with communication, whether they're biological like mine or cultural, like I was encountering there in South Africa, where you had, generation upon generation of people who were denied schooling, right? So they might be perfectly capable. They might have been analytical processors that could have gone with the science of reading and developed reading in their language and all these types of things, but they were just denied by matter of policy, and so that didn't happen. There was another group that I got involved with, a professional group with international memberships, and so I would go to Calgary and teach. I would go to Ottawa and teach. I'd go various places. And then as a young wandering person, when I first went to college, I couldn't read. And I leveraged my social networks of friends to help me. I went to play football, American football. And so, obviously we can't see each other and be in the same room with each other. But I am about the same size as I was when I was 17, and I am 6'7" and 285 pounds. So you can imagine a college football program that would take a 17-year-old at that size in the 80s. So I went off to play football, and then at the time, again, football classes, they were anthropology appreciation. Would you like to see a picture of a monkey? Yeah, it's great. All right, in May. I didn't have to worry about any academics. But then I got hurt. Couldn't read, and I'm at college, and I have friends and so on. But again, I'm trying to string together, like, why isn't this working for me? And it just didn't. And so I left. I was a bit angry. I had all the family, issues, being adopted and taken from my family and all that stuff. I was an angry young man and emotionally just kind of off the rails a bit. And I just took, and a couple of friends and I We wandered the world. And I ended up living in Germany. I ended up working there. At first, I was on a tourist visa, working there, odd jobs stringing together and so on. And then my visa expired and I stuck around it and, kind of did what I needed to do. Basically, in that period of my life, I worked my way from Long Beach, California, up to the San Francisco Bay Area, across the entirety of the United States and Western Europe, basically by my own wits. And again, using those energy states to kind of feel people out on what I could do to help them. Somebody who's big and strong and kind of handy, but can't read. And so along the way, I got taken advantage of massively by contracts and stuff. But I think, working with a variety of people, with that kind of introduction, you learn that, people want their basic needs satisfied, right? I'm a big fan of Glasser's choice theory, that we're always trying to satisfy a basic need. And sometimes those basic needs overlap and conflict and so on. It makes a lot more sense to me than, say, Maslow's hierarchy. But if you could figure out a way, and I tell this to my autistic friends who have autistic children, if you could find a way to satisfy somebody's basic needs, you can kind of make a living out of it, right? Whatever that happens to be. And I'm by no means some big brawling capitalist or whatever, but those that have found a way to satisfy basic needs of people tend to do okay, right? And it might not be what the parents want. It might not be what you thought it might be. But you can usually scratch together a fairly okay living. And some people manage to do quite well with it. This is America, land of opportunity and all of that kind of stuff. But I managed to do that, right? I'm by no means rich or wealthy, but I managed to scratch together a living and support a bit of a family and have fun doing it.
You have an upcoming book that teaches literacy for Gestalt language processors. What would be some ways to determine if an autistic person is a Gestalt language processor as compared to the more common analytic language processing?
Sure. I usually start because people don't have any idea what I'm talking about when I go down that route. They've never heard the term before. And that's fine because it's not out there really in America. And I guess for much of the West, the global North, we send a kid to school to learn English. And they either do or they don't. If they do, everything's fine, right? Chances are very good, higher than 80% you're an analytic language processor. You get the breakdown of the language into its constituent parts. You can put it together from its parts to its whole, and you can follow a conversation. You can write a writing prompt and all these types of things. But for those of us that can't, we're at first inducing panic in our parents. We're confounding our teachers. And then committees are convened and we're given IEPs here in America, the individualized educational plans, and we're sent off to language pathologists to figure out why we're not getting. The current availability of language pathologists for public school and Title I is very low. And for those pathologists that are available for public schools, right, they're for the most part behind in their minutes and these types of things. So the outcomes are not really there. My generation, there was no acknowledgement that we even existed. How I find it works is because I sound funny, right? I don't sound like the population I support, right? The Los Angeles Unified School District is almost 90% Hispanic, maybe even more than 90%. And my school, I think, is probably 95% Hispanic. And so they all have variations on a Spanish accent. They come from Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador on my caseload alone. So I don't sound anything like the people that I serve, right? I sound like my grandmother. And I found Gestalt language processors in my classroom because we love the way language feels. We love the way it sounds. And when you mix that with alexithymia, we begin to sound like each other. So I found students going and giving presentations in front of the class, and they have a bit of a Westie accent like me. I'm thinking, well, a kid from Oaxaca, I wouldn't expect that, right? But here you are, and there's various ways of sorting that out. You give somebody, because I support high school, right, the 9th and 10th and 11th grades, you give somebody a writing prompt, and they sit there and stare at it because they don't know where to begin. Right? They have nothing to latch it onto. They have no scripts available. They have no gestalts available. There are various clues, but in my professional capacity, I'm not allowed to diagnose this. I'm not allowed to really comment on it in an official way. But I can have wonderful conversations with parents about it. I could say to parents of a 9th grader, that I'm aware that your child who's been given an eligibility for services of a specific learning disability, I know what that is. I know why they're doing this. And it's not that there's anything wrong with them, it's that the system isn't designed to support them. So here's what the situation is, and here's how within the current system we can do that. In just the 3 years since I've joined public education, as it were, as opposed to like professionally training people in analytical trigonometry and so on, but being here in public school, I found that this learner is completely unsupported. And I thought about my own journey and how it was that I emerged through the stages of language development as a GLP and the different helps that I had along the way and what was very important for me in latching onto things and where I still struggle. And I thought last year I ran what's called a learning center for reading development. I implemented some of the things in my classroom that I had gone through in occupational therapy and in speech therapy and other places in my life. And they worked with great effect. And scores improved and all that stuff. And parents are like, wow, how did this happen? I was like, well, I just brought something in from outside. And, I give them a bit of my story as to why it's effective. And I thought to myself, after going through teacher training as an autistic person in a space that was designed assuming that I don't exist and that I'll never be there and that I will never inhabit these professional spaces as a peer to neurotypical people, I wrote the first book, No Place for Autism, right, to kind of on tragedy autism and just break it down as it's a variant in humanity, like brown hair versus blonde hair versus green eyes and so on. It's been with us forever. Here's the theoretical framework for that. Here's the historical evidence for it. Here's the work on genes and stuff that a lot of people don't find because they don't know where to look. They never heard of Jared Reeser and the solitary forager hypothesis of autism or anything like this. So I presented this and I found a publisher that was really interested in having this lived experience point of view, right? I went into professional training as a special educator and I had autism as an experience dictated to me by someone who wasn't themselves autistic, but was deemed an expert because they had a child who was autistic. And the framework was totally different. I found that a lot of the things were quite harmful that they were suggesting. Essentially, that if we just implemented these therapies, these pesky little buggers wouldn't be around us anymore like this, and they'd be altogether more pleasant. And I thought about all the trauma involved in that, right, for the actual person. And I started to push back a bit, not vocally, but this was a remote learning during COVID, just in the chat, just dropping links to stuff that I'd written, and I was counseled. I was counseled by human resources that these trainings are monologues. They're not dialogues, and that the esteemed instructor, didn't appreciate it, that I was out of line, and that I should consider this my verbal warning against ever doing that again. All right. And I had this conversation with the fellow who was starting a publishing company, and he said, well, I'd love for you to write that as a book, right? How to actually describe the autistic type. And so eventually became the title, No Place for Autism, question mark, is there no place for us? But outlining the case and examining, how does the Chinese view this? How do the Maori view this? How do African countries, Myanmar, these types of places, not just the English-speaking world, but how is autism viewed? And if we consider that it's 2 to 5% of the human population, that's a lot of autistic people. And so just kind of recognizing that, and that if you have an autistic child, chances are very good that that very quirky grandfather that was memorizing movie scripts is probably the autistic person in that generation and so on. And we can, as autistic people, we can look back in our family tree. I can identify my uncle and my sister. I can identify my grandmother's brother by behaviors and attitudes and life trajectories that mirror my own. And so how far back do we have to look to say it's not a tragedy? My great uncle Charles was a brilliant photographer. My uncle Ed was a forensic scientist, right? And these types of things, even though we had no contact, I didn't meet that side of my family because I was taken away from it. I didn't meet them until well into my career as a forensic scientist. And I found out, coincidentally, my uncle Ed was a forensic scientist as well. So getting into the language thing, I thought, well, in order to solve the problem, we have to teach English teachers that we're here and that we have an entirely different path to literacy. And that it's not new, right? A lot of the work that was done in the 80s and then kind of repackaged in the mid-2000s around Gestalt language processing from a speech and language pathology point of view, we can certainly take that information into the English language classroom, into our other academic classrooms, and build strategies around that. An easy example of storyboarding in there. If I'm encountering a Gestalt processor and I say, say they're 10th grade in America, and I say, here's a language prompt, I want 500 words on this topic. A Gestalt processor who has no interest in that topic, right? Because as kids, high school kids don't have any interest in any topics presented by teachers. Let's be honest about it, right? They care about video games and manga and TikToks. And so if it's not within that realm, talk to me about Julius Caesar or talk to me a Catcher in the Rye or something like that. There's complete blanks. I take an episode out of my own language development, out of therapy, if you will, to say, all right, we're going to just dissect the prompt, because functional illiteracy means that you can navigate language a bit. You can read it, right? You generally, Gestalt processors generally have good prosody and pace because we love the intonation. We love how it sounds. We love how it feels. And generally, we're remembering it. We're internalizing it based on where we first heard it. That's why we're great at movie quotes and song lines and lyrics and these types of things. And we can generally do really well at karaoke. But if you ask us to comprehend Shakespeare, we're lost, right? Especially if it's a topic that we're not at all interested in. And understanding all of this, understanding what's going on in our head, how we feel about things, understanding alexithymia, if that's present. We can dissect these writing prompts in high school into their kind of 4 basic constituent parts. Right? What are the 4 things that they really want to know? How are we going to explain this, right? Because a 500-word prompt is generally a 4-paragraph prompt. I'm going to pull 4 things out of there that I think are kind of important. And I'm going to put them as titles of storyboard cells. For example, if I gave you a prompt about some random topic, but I said, I wanted you to imagine a forest. Right? You don't have to know everything about forest management and forest this and that, but we're in AP environmental science, and I want you to write me a prompt about a forest. And so what are some of the elements what do we know about forests, and what do we wonder about forests? Well, we know there's a lot of trees, right? And we know that they're vital for the ecosystem and oxygen and so on. So I'm listening to them say this, and I'm pulling words, and I'm summarizing these words in these 4 panels: trees, and greenery, and oxygen, and whatnot. And then I say, okay, fine. So we have these words and we kind of know what they mean, but I want you to draw me a picture of what this looks like. When you visualize this in your brain, what does a forest look like? What does air look like, right? Or wind or whatever. What do these things look like? And just take some time. It doesn't have to be brilliant. It doesn't have to be modern art masterpiece, but just sketch it out. And so we give them some time and some space to do that. And then I say to them, because here we have fairly crowded spaces, but everybody has a table partner. So turn to your table partner. And I want you to tell them in your own words what's going on in each of these cells. And their job is to take notes, the words that they hear. I don't need full sentences. I just want what feels important to them that you're talking about. And so they'll take notes, and then they'll switch, and then they'll exchange information. We'll hand over the notes. It's great. Well, guess what you've just done? You've created your own sentence starters. You've created your own paragraph starters, and you've gotten those words, those script, those gestalts out of your head in a format that now all you have to do is rearrange them, and you've got your 500 words. It's not hard. And it turns out that analytic processors like that too. And then what blows my mind is I went to the University of Toronto to learn how to teach speakers of other languages English. I have a TEFL certificate from the University of Toronto. And they do this type of stuff all the time, right? When you're teaching English as a foreign language, they do this kind of communicative, collaborative, it's great. But in an American classroom, teaching English is so very rigid, and it has to be a certain way, and our grammar has to be perfect the first time, and all these types of things are scored. When we just want to know what they know, we can back off that a little bit. And I make the argument here in Los Angeles that the majority of my students are speakers of English as a foreign language because their home language is likely Spanish. Their neighborhood language is Spanish. When they go to the store, they go to the Spanish-speaking store, the Super A, the Supermercado, these types of things, right? And so the only time they're speaking English is when they're in this foreign land, this high school, right? So we can take all of these methodologies that aren't new or novel, and we can put them into the instruction of teachers. Let's get away from the science of reading because it doesn't work, right? It works 60% of the time tops. And you can see the trajectory since we started tinkering with language instruction in America. You can see the trajectory downwards of the literacy scores and the comprehension scores. And here we have test or punish next to No Child Left Behind, right? So you have these situations where we know it's not working. There has to be a better way. And so having this discussion with my publisher from the autism book, I said, well, why don't I put together all of this stuff? It exists, right? I'm not creating anything new. I'm just taking it from a place where it has been for a while. It worked on me. It worked on a lot of people like me, but it was never a feature of an English language classroom. The premise for the new book, Holistic Language Instruction, is to teach English language teachers, to teach the English teachers how this stuff works. Doing the research around it, I found that a lot of different cultures who are multilingual, like in Africa, for example, or in Singapore, to be more specific, where you have multiple official languages, one of which is English, they teach this way. They teach language this way. I don't think anybody in America would think of Singapore as underdeveloped, right? They're quite cutting edge, and their schools are quite competitive, probably in the top of the world. And this is how they teach English. And so I'm thinking, why don't we do that same thing here? Why don't we teach everybody in the same classroom? Instead of taking 60% and teaching to their style and taking the other 40% and putting them off into therapy. It doesn't make any sense to me.
How can our listeners learn about your upcoming book and you beyond this interview, Jim?
I have a pretty unique last name, thanks to a misspelling. I think mine is the only version of my last name that exists like that on Amazon, for example, or in America. But if you search for me on Amazon, you can find my current book, No Place for Autism. You can find me on LinkedIn. I write on a Substack called Outside, AUTSIDE, at Substack. Again, you could just Google my last name and find thousands upon thousands of things that I've written over the years on a variety of topics. But I'm constantly chatting to people on the LinkedIn Messenger or on Instagram Messenger and whatnot when they have basic questions. And just a very quick, hey, what do you think about this? And I send off a resource or two or whatnot. So I'm kind of out there in that community, and I don't have a political dog in the fight. I just like to help people. I answer things honestly, and let things go where they go.
Well, I really enjoyed the conversation immensely, Jim. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll continue to follow you on LinkedIn and Substack.
All right. Thank you for your time.
Thanks so much to Jim for the conversation. To learn more about Jim, please check out the link in the podcast description of this episode. Here at Autism Personal Coach, our clients are the experts, our coaches are the guides. The majority of supports for autistics are not helpful. They try to fix us, not support us. That's why many are confused when we say our clients are the experts of their lived experience. Our clients are the experts for what has worked for them and about the things that they need and want in their lives. Our coaches first listen to our clients, then ask thoughtful questions, offer resources, and strategize with our clients so they can get what they need to thrive. Would you want a guide in your life to coach you to get you the things you desire? If so, then visit autismpersonalcoach.com for more information. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Autism Stories, and if you did, if you could tell a friend, foe, or anyone you know about it so they could have the same enjoyable and educational experience as you when listening to Autism Stories, it would be very much appreciated. Until next time, I'm Doug Bletcher of Autism Personal Coach. Talk to you then.